All right, the doors are open, so no one else is in the room. It could happen that someone else walks in. This is the Attack Jeff on Anything session. Obviously, third part of a trilogy. I had Ask Jeff Anything, Debate Jeff on Anything, and then Attack Jeff on Anything. And it's interesting. I had positive comments on Facebook, which I'll look up because I can go through those and comment on those somewhat. On the Debate Jeff on Anything, the last one, I had a bunch of comments about things that people wanted, complaints essentially, when I posted it in one of the Facebook groups, and so I addressed those. In this session, they were positive comments about me, and so I assumed some people would show up with some things that they didn't like that I was doing, or some things they wanted to debate. There's obviously a lot of information out there on me, and I've written a lot at jeffthinks.com on all sorts of subjects. I'm up to almost 400 articles. I read the monthly article in the White Lake Beacon on local politics focused on Dalton. And so there's a lot of information for people to object to. And I thought it would be good to have that dialogue, that deliberative aspect of politics, which is ideal. And then there's so much limitation, and you see it in politicians, you see it in actors and actresses and singers, in that they want to do something, and there's a little bit of a fame aspect that goes with it. There's obviously in a very small capacity. Obviously, Dalton Township is 9,400 people. Nevertheless, they don't want then the rest of their lives pried into, but it has to go that way. So I've made it very explicit that politics from the village to the township, to the county, to the state, to the nation, to international, philosophy, religion, history, literature, whatever someone might disagree with me on, because my views are out there and they would want to go over and debate or just say what they thought I had wrong. And so I don't use my phone as much as I use a computer, and and I think Facebook and social media in general is very dangerous for mental health. I'll go over my view on that somewhat. I will find the post here, because there were comments on it. All right. So, Mark had said, great township supervisor, hide nothing, all in the open or real first, which I appreciate, and and some people agreed on that. The transparency thing is big for me, obviously. I think it's important. That's why I started recording and posting meetings, releasing more and more information. We're up to the point where I release the entire board packet along with reference packets each month, and that's publicly available for people to see. And I'm going to work on getting the website redone so it functions a little better, so people can use it easier and connect better as a communication tool, because that's really what it should be, and so people can see ordinances better and all of those things. And there's also a confidentiality aspect, right? Some things have to be confidential, especially about employee records and things like that. And I see no reason to destroy people either. I think that the motivation usually comes out of some version of resentment, which I think is the most destructive human emotion. I think the most common human emotion is fear. And the most destructive human emotion is resentment. I think you see that very clearly in less than 400 words in Cain and Abel, which has been popular for a few thousand years at least. And so and then I think you see a whole trend. I wrote an article on resentment as the path to destruction. And I think I try to avoid that, at least. And then I try to be transparent and open about discussing any of these types of things, anything that someone might disagree with. And I have no problem with disagreeing either. It's not like everyone's going to come together on everything. I would be considered heretical in almost every tradition, in almost every sphere, right? Politics, religion, whatever it may be. Because I have a tendency to free think, and so I don't go with whatever you're supposed to go with necessarily. But to be a heretic, you have to see value in the tradition. Right? So you're pulling from the tradition, but you don't accept the full thing. And that is essentially the definition of a heretic. I get that from Hilaire Belloc. He was a Catholic writer from the early 1900s in England. Very good works, and also worked on distributism with G.K. Chesterton, another Catholic writer from the early 1900s. Wrote The Father Brown, Mr. Sears. Very good stuff. All right. MR said, awesome, I like your vulnerability. I think it will make your township, it will take your township a long way. Which I think is important as well, right? There's, even though I'm not the past political regime in the township, I think there needs to almost always be an aspect of something like repentance, because that's how things get better, how internal change happens. And to do that, you have to reveal what's wrong, right? The transparent aspect, and then the organization and the people in the organization have to repent of the wrongdoings. And repentance, I'm defining it as something like a deeper version of regret, which then causes an internal change, which blossoms into an external change, right? I think it's hugely important. I think when religion is doing its best work, that is one major aspect that it focuses on. As it veers from that, I think it veers off of where it should. And so I think that's important in government and politics, and there's a very strong tendency in politics, all organizations, where any power is being collected for there not to be an admittance of wrongdoing or mistakes and things like those. And then you get a non-corrective feedback loop. And the feedback loops, and I talked about it in this position before, I wrote an article on it, how power corrupts. That the feedback loops in this position are very weird. And I think you see that in this meeting, right? There's a meeting with nobody in it where I'm asking people to attack me on anything they want. I think it's a good demonstration of that. In that, when people are fairly happy with the way things are going politically, they're disengaged, right? They're not really engaged with it. And then when they do get engaged, it's over one specific aspect that irks them in some way. And we might have reactions, emotional reactions to something that occurs and then complain about it. But usually political involvement, especially in modern American society, doesn't really go deeper than that. And I don't think that's necessarily good. My father, when I was young, highly emphasized the ability to argue both sides of an argument. And argument in the technical sense, right? Not yelling. I don't yell. You can ask anyone. And that idea of being able to debate both sides is basically the same definition of thinking itself. And so I do consider that very important. Now, that can lead to an amount of doubt or skepticism that I don't think is balanced or healthy, and it can lead to indecision. So you have to be able to come out on one side or the other on the debate. But if you can't argue the other side of the debate, then you're missing their perspective. Like, there's a reason they hold their position. And if you can't argue their side relatively strong, then you don't know what their perspective is. And so you're missing something big, and you're missing something important. And so this idea of being vulnerable to the other side, to the other arguments, I think is important. Melissa said, thank you for all of your support at the horse park. And that, it's funny because it's been relatively minor. Last year we ordered a couple $100 worth of trail markers, and then the people that do activities out at the horse trail went and put them out because they said our maintenance isn't going to know. It'll probably end up wrong if our maintenance ends up doing it. They're not part of the horse trail. And so, small thing, our maintenance this year ended up putting in a horse sign that was redone by one of the people associated with the horse trail. So they're working with us as well. We put in a relatively minor amount of effort, but we don't want to hinder those types of things. And the horse trail can be fairly controversial. Basically, anything that touches politics becomes hugely controversial, and or has the potential to, and has a tendency to. And I think there's a few different reasons for that. But one is that essentially politics is a huge negotiation, right? So it's the alternative to direct violence. So in that way, politics is highly important and beneficial and good as a peacemaking institution, which is ironic. Right, because I agree with the Anatomy of the State by Murray Rothbard, who's the founder of modern American libertarian movement. And in that, he basically comes out as the government has no choice but to be evil because of its natural tendencies. And I largely agree with that. Roger Williams made the same case in the 1600s, and that's where the idea of separation of church and state comes from, which I've talked about in different articles and things. Hugely important, right? The jump from Roger Williams to William Penn to James Madison to Thomas Jefferson and into the American tradition is hugely influential. And it's kind of those things that at some point that I would like someone to come here and say, no, it's really the Anabaptists from Europe before Roger Williams that were founded the idea of the separation of church and state would be, really cool. Because that's a very legitimate point. But nevertheless, the horse part ends up being somewhat controversial on different levels. But I think that's mostly because it's this political realm of you're trying to have 9,400 people, approximately, right? 9,400 people are trying to negotiate through the same institution, through the township government. And 1,300 of those people live in the village, of course, so they have their own council, and a lot of it happens there for them. But everyone else, this is their smallest level of government. And Twin Lake is an unincorporated census-taking area wholly contained within the township of Dalton. And so when you're doing petitions, because it's wholly contained in the township, you can put Twin Lake and they're still legitimate, rather than the 12th page of some government document. And this idea of a mass negotiation is difficult. You're going to have people disagree. You figure if you have a handful of people that are trying to negotiate something out, it'd be hard to get them on the same page. To get thousands of people, and then we get into the wider realm, millions of people on the same page is an impossibility. So there's always going to be some disagreement there. And then I think there's some aspect of an expectation of deception, an expectation of people acting in bad faith, an expectation of bad things in government, which then becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And then the self-fulfilling prophecy of badness creates and reinforces the paranoia that's in politics, and then that paranoia leads into more of those bad things and bad actions. And there's actually an interesting research study by Karen Miller on deception in relationships, and I think this is immensely insightful. And it's the idea of students and employers is who they were studying, employers and workers, and then students and schools. And if a person lies, do they feel guilty, right? And it's becoming this interesting question. And it's based on expectation. But people have to have the same expectation of morality around that, or ethics around that issue. And they have to expect the other person to expect that. If any part of that is not there, if any part of that is broken, the person that lies won't actually feel guilty, which I think is quite disturbing to know. And I purposely seek out a lot of disturbing information to know, because I think humans have a strong tendency to avoid uncomfortable reality. And contacting reality, I think, is the most important thing, contacting reality and contacting truth. And I think goodness lies in there. There's a big philosophical movement in our society currently to separate truth and goodness. And that is, I think, detrimental. And most people will go with a version of goodness over truth, which will, moving away from reality and towards delusion, will always lead to badness. And usually along the way and in the end, I do believe, and I think we can point that out. There's in a bunch of different ways. One is Karl Bonhoeffer. This is an interesting thing in history. So his son is more known, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He's a Lutheran pastor. He was in the United States when Hitler officially took power, went back to Germany to resist Hitler, and ended up dying right near the end of the war in a prison. Some of his writings are just spectacular. His one essay from prison that is called After 10 Years is an amazing work, and everyone should read it. And I have lots of works like that. I keep lists on those things. But his father, Karl Bonhoeffer, was a famous psychiatrist, and he ended up losing 2 sons and 2 son-in-laws to the Nazis. And he lived. They had an early plot against Hitler where they were going to snatch him traveling in between meetings, and then have Karl Bonhoeffer commit him to an insane asylum, which would be very, very appropriate. It was a good plan, and Hitler ended up switching his meeting schedule, and they missed him. But I think well, in his last professional work, I believe his last professional work, which I don't think has been translated into English, but is available in German, and I had a computer translate it so I could read it. He was assessing what happened in Germany at that time, and I believe in the final paragraph, right near the end of the paper, it comes to the conclusion that there was just mass delusion that happened at the time. And so that's interesting. And the last comment on here is CJ, and while you seem to be doing a very good job, but if you insist, Jeffrey, you need to enjoy your job even more, because when you do, you achieve even more. Keep up the good work. I have been around and seen a lot of administrators from townships to cities, but you are tops. You know, which I appreciate that, and I really didn't come in to administrate as much. I came into the role as, no, I came in as a reformer, but the administration part is important. And so I knew there were financial problems. I didn't know the specifics of them, but I said that when I get in, I will tackle them. I'll make the township transparent, and I will attempt to lead it towards freedom in a reasonable and rational way, right? Because there are movements that don't work in that way, and they don't come out positive towards like small agriculture and farming and being business friendly and these types of things. And I think we have made solid progress in that direction. I was just at the road commission meeting this morning, and we had a few important things happening there for Dalton, and someone else, a new clerk in Cedar Creek, and maybe him and the supervisor in Houghton mentioned that they knew that a lot of things had been changing in Dalton. But I think we are using the process that is how you're supposed to change things. Because a lot of times people come in with the idea of radical change, right? My ideals would be radical. But people a lot of times don't understand the purpose of an ideal is to set a direction. And setting a direction and getting there are two majorly different things. So like in zoning, I think the United States has largely walked in the wrong direction for about 100 years because the big court cases, the big Supreme Court case, Ambler Realty Company versus the Village of Euclid, was 1926. And that overturned a Northern District of Ohio Circuit Court case from 1924 that had ruled the village's zoning at the time unconstitutional according to the 14th Amendment. And I think there was sketchy stuff at the time on how that got passed in a 6-3 split for the Supreme Court. William Howard Taft, a former president, was the head of the Supreme Court at the time. Calvin Coolidge was the president, who I like. But I don't like this thing that occurred, and the head of the Department of Commerce was Herbert Hoover before he was president, and I think things went bad with creating the administrative state under the Department of Commerce when Hoover was in charge at that time. But if you've gone in the wrong direction for 100 years, you can't just jump back all of a sudden. And you can't do it just from the top. The change has to occur at all levels. But it definitely has to rise from the bottom to the top. There has to be a tendency in that direction. And the rise and fall of societies is an interesting study. There's a bunch of good work on it, but one of my favorites is Peter Turchin, who's doing current work on it about this movement that has to happen both at the bottom of society and the top of society at the same time. And so this idea of a huge jump is something you can observe in history. The English Civil War, I think, is the best example, and fairly recent. In the 1600s, England is where a lot of the idea of America came from, right? There's a whole history of that going back a long ways. This idea of freedom. Ancient Greece was obviously huge into that debate as well. But really, it's the Charter of Liberties in 1100 under Henry I, who was the third son of William the Conqueror, who had conquered from Normandy. They were Vikings. They had conquered part of France and then lived there for a few generations, called Normandy in 1066, sailed across and conquered England. And a lot of interesting history and stuff there, because his oldest son Robert ended up going in the Crusades, and he was the Duke of Normandy, so William II took over, but then he had imprisoned in Normandy when he was King of England. His younger brother Henry became Henry I. And that's where you get last names in the Western culture come in. Like their 3 last names were nicknames that they got from their father, William the Conqueror, right? Because the whole name was William. And so nicknames started becoming last names, and they all became important last names in European history. A bunch of interesting stuff there. nevertheless, to get coronated, he had to work out a deal with the nobles in 1100, and you get the Charter of Liberties, which was a minor step in a good direction. And then 1215, you get the Magna Carta, which is super important and well known. And the Archbishop of Canterbury ended up basing that on the legal precedent, right? The legal precedent that it was standing on was the Charter of Liberties in 1100. Then you get a number of adaptations of that over the years, and because it was reaffirmed and remade. 1628, you get the Petition of Right, written by Sir Edward Coke, and which is hugely important. I mean, 4 of our 10 amendments come from the Petition of Right, even though it's not largely known or studied now. And then you get the 1689 English Bill of Rights, and then you get the American Bill of Rights from 1789 and 1791, depending on whether you want to count when the Congress passed it or when it was ratified by the states. And that 1600s period, it starts off early on with the bonfire plot, which was Guy Fawkes and Robert Catesby trying to blow up the entire Parliament and the royal family in 1605. And it ends in, I would say really that transition period ends in 1688 with the Glorious Revolution, when William and Mary came over from the Netherlands and ended up taking over after Charles II largely, but there had been a few years in between there where James tried to take over as a Catholic and everything, even though the country was decently Protestant by that point. Very controversial, all those religious wars. But right in the middle there, in the 1640s, you've got Charles I, who was considered a tyrant. And so there was an uprising against him, the Puritans, and they ended up chopping off his head on a stage. And Oliver Cromwell ended up taking over for 10 years and was even more tyrannical as the Lord Protector. When he died, his son tried to take over. It didn't work out. It was a very short period of time. Charles II was living on the continent in Flanders, which we call Belgium now, and he came back across, and people largely welcomed him. He said, right? They said, oh, like a king's better than the Puritans. And so that idea of this radical swing when things are bad to make this wild and crazy change is destabilizing and usually doesn't work out that well. Like it can stabilize over time, but you're looking at decades. And it's one of the downfalls of, well, now we get into the definition of capitalism, right? So we think of society in terms of being a choice between capitalism and communism. And it depends on how you define those things. If you define capitalism as private ownership rights, then I think it's a good thing. But it can be structured in such a way that power tends to concentrate into a few hands. And then communism is, or socialism, which mean the same thing, right? I mean, Karl Marx and Frederick Engels wrote the Communist Manifesto, which I have articles on called The Opposite of Communism, Part 1 and Part 2. And very interesting to study. Engels said in one of his introductions in the late 1800s that they meant the same thing even then, the words had come together. So people try to separate those. But what you're really looking at in all these words is an equivocation fallacy. And that's where people are using the same word to mean two different things. And so the conversation doesn't work. And you can see people talking, and they're trying to have a conversation. And if you understand that they're defining the words in two different ways, you can realize why the conversation isn't really a conversation. It's just two people talking at each other. They're not really exchanging information. They're not really talking with each other. And there's, I would say there is a third method, distributism, of local property rights for emphasizing small ownership that would actually make a good society, is what our good societies have emerged out of. That's not heavily emphasized. Nevertheless, that type of wild instability and this idea of dropping, looking out into the future. Joseph Schumpeter, one of my favorite economists, he might be like number 5 for a favorite economist. And he's good. He came up with the idea of creative destruction, which is how new technology cancels out old technology and eliminates entire industries, creates entire industries. That's probably what he's most famous for, I do believe. But he has, in one of his books, it's Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy, I think is the title. And there's a section in there called Can Capitalism Survive, which is actually published as its own book too, and it should be. And in that, he goes through the psychology of why capitalist societies do have a tendency to erode. I think a better take on that is The Law by Frederick Bastiat, published in France in 1850, part of the French liberal school, my favorite school of economics, with D. Tracy, who was the favorite, I would make the case, the favorite economist of Thomas Jefferson, as well Antoine Louis Claude Destutt de Tracy. And one of his books was translated from the French into the English by Thomas Jefferson himself. And then Jean-Baptiste Say, which is hugely important. There's Say's Law, which means, which is basically to have stuff, you have to make stuff. And if you don't make stuff, you don't have stuff. And people argue against that a huge amount. So John Maynard Keynes and Paul Krugman, have basically made entire careers trying to argue against Say's Law, which is kind of wild, because it's a movement away from reality by using numbers and trying to move numbers around to make reality not real. Nevertheless. Joseph Schumpeter makes the case that this idea of looking less and less into the future and less over generations ends up being a huge part of the downfall of society, which I think is true in people looking short term. Because if you're really looking at society changing, you have to be looking out decades and generations. And that's very important, because that's how it actually happens in history. And so I can talk about a lot of stuff. Of course, I think everyone that knows me realizes that I don't have a necessary need to be highly social myself, but I can talk as much as people would like, and I like to get information out there. I like to have the discussions. I like to know what people are thinking, and I like to try to get understanding moving in both directions. And so I'm writing an article right now. I'm working on one for the White Lake Beacon. I've had a few false starts on articles over the last couple of weeks, which is pretty normal in my writing process. But the one I'm working on right now, I believe I have the title, which sometimes I put the title on last, sometimes it comes on first, is called Reaction, Revolution, and Reform. Right? And it's kind of about the idea of how do you create a change that sticks, a positive change, a good change, that then sticks in the society and starts moving it in the right direction so it can continue to move in that direction. And it's difficult to do on the practical level. I think there is a lack of understanding and study of history in society in general. That tends to be the case, and it is currently in the United States as well. And then everyone tries to get a hold of the control of education, and especially the teaching of history, because if you can really control that, then you can control the thinking of the next generation, which means you own the future, which is what everyone's working towards, is realizing their values of things in the present and moving into the future. There's a great book called Why Don't We Learn from History? It's pretty small too, by B.H. Liddell Hart, who's the greatest modern historian in military matters, and it's a very good book. And the essential premise, he states it. He doesn't state it as like the final conclusion statement of the book or anything like that. But it's definitely in there, is that there's an uncomfortableness with encountering the truth. And so we have a tendency to deceive ourselves on certain things that would make us uncomfortable. And so in that way, that's a big part of the reason that we don't have a tendency to learn from history. Another thing in modern society is that there's just so much information. There's too much to keep up with. And so you can't process it all. You can't even be exposed to it all. There's just too much out there. If you try to, you just can't consume it. We don't have the processing capacity as humans for the data that is in the world today and the data that is accessible. I personally own thousands of books. I've personally read thousands of books, and that's a ridiculous amount of information, and it is nothing compared to the number of books that get published on a monthly basis, which is amazing. And so there's just so much data. And then we have so much communication. I actually think a huge thing that's detrimental to society right now is the interaction on the internet, which in the 1990s was this frontier of freedom that was super good and super important, and now it's starting to be controlled by the governments and those types of things, of course, in some bad ways for sure. And there's always reasons for how those things come about, and there are trade-offs. Right? There are trade-offs. So one of my favorite economists, my favorite living economist, Thomas Sowell, he's probably better as a sociologist, but he recommends 3 questions when you're encountering something. At what cost, which is great question. compared to what, which I think is an even more powerful question, and then what proof do you have for that, which I think is a powerful question. And then there's a Christian apologist I like that gives speeches, and he's an interesting guy. I disagree with a lot of his stuff, of course. And but Frank Turek, and he emphasizes 3 questions that he got from someone else. And how did you arrive at that conclusion? What does that mean? And would you consider? So I think I got the order wrong on some of those questions for both of them. I think I reversed 2 and 1 in both of those sets. But nevertheless, you know, great questions to ask that I don't think are asked enough in enough spheres. And so, but this social media is a huge, I think, almost fundamental change in how in what human is and what humanity is. And there are some great experiments by John Calhoun on rat universes, he called them, in the 1960s and 70s, and he set up paradise, essentially, studies population. And he'd set up enough space and enough food and enough water, enough of all the resources they need, start out with a few mice, and then just observe how the population changed over years. They would observe these. And the population would never get up to, not even really near, peak of like half of what it was supposed to as far as how high it could go number-wise. And then there were interesting behavioral changes that changed across the generations. You know, increases in infertility, and breeding age would increase, and territoriality of males would go down, and a bunch of different things like self-harm would come in, and some interesting things. Desmond Morris is an interesting zoologist and ethnologist. My 2 favorite ethnologists in the study of animal behavior, but specifically I focus on humans, are Hans Haas is interesting, and his major book on it is hard to get, on human nature. A bunch of people have written books on human nature. That one's good. Roger Scruton's on human nature is very good. He's a British philosopher that died recently. And then Irenaeus Ebel-Ebelsfeld is my other favorite ethnologist, and he wrote ethology. He wrote the textbook Ethology. He wrote the textbook Human Ethology, and a bunch of good research there. But Desmond Morris was a British zoologist who ran the London Zoo, I do believe, and he wrote The Naked Ape in the 1970s, which has some interesting theories on the hunting ape and that type of thing. But he proposed there was this correlation between animals in cages and humans as well. So, you know, we live in boxes called houses, and then we drive in boxes called cars, and then we work in boxes called offices or factories, whatever it may be. We shop in boxes called stores. And so we display a lot of the same issues, self-harm and misaligned eating patterns, you know, eating too much, eating too little, those types of things as animals. And he thought they were the same things that caged animals were having happen mentally to them, and I think there's a lot of truth to that. And so getting outside of the box frees us up, and it's why going for a walk or a run or a hike or a bicycle ride or a motorcycle ride or a horse ride are so refreshing, right? Get us out of the box. Get back to Calhoun. So these changes occur over generations, and if you map it out over humans, it'd be generations as well, but our generations are a lot longer than rats, of course. And on the surface, they talk about overcrowding in the population and the population density. And I think that's true, but if you ask why does the population density and overcrowding cause these various types of issues and eventually the collapse of all these societies, right? None of these rat societies were able to survive. The entire population got wiped out. And humans would be more complex than that in the world because there's isolated spots and things like that. But I think the actual cause is something I believe he mentions in one of his papers, one of his longer papers that's not usually read, is social velocity. And it's this amount of interactions with strangers. And there's such a huge thing now for being logged off of social media and that type of thing. And people do, I've noticed people, that they get mentally healthier when they log off of social media. And I'm on a bunch of social media. I don't interact on it a ton. I started debating philosophy in a pretty serious way when we got a computer when I was 12 on message boards and those types of things. So I've been debating philosophy for a long time. And every mistake you could possibly make in a discussion and in a conversation online, I have made it, right? So over the last couple of decades. And so I completely understand all of that and extremely useful in that way. But this idea of social velocity, I think the internet that, and then social media especially has made it so the entire world is encountering the same problem at the same time. And before, you would largely just encounter it in cities, you know, and people in the rural area notice in cities, and we don't have any major cities very close. Grand Rapids is you know, a smaller city, and so Chicago is our nearest major city. But people there are different because you have this immense amount of interaction with strangers, and as society develops, we get more of that, and I think it's changing things in some major fundamental ways. And then social media rolled that out on this huge scale in a super fast way. So that's an interesting change that people are trying to adapt to, and I think it's really dividing people in some interesting ways. And you know, I think it's good for people to be able to debate politics online and this type of thing. I don't think it in general leads to anything very beneficial, which is why I try to have things like this where people could come in person and we could have the conversation that way, and then people could watch it online, but a real discussion, you know, human to human, like humans are designed to communicate, because interaction online is not a real, fully human interaction. And so, and I taught English online for 5 years and loved that job. You make a noticeable difference, a change in kids' lives and things, and you know, I have some great stories out of that. There was Angelina, she was 12, right in there somewhere, and her grades weren't very good in China. Her family's moving to Australia, and she's horrible at English, so her parents are looking at something. They heard about me, and I had well over 1,000 students, over 1,500 students over the 5 years, and a lot of those were short because I was onboarding them into the companies I was working for. I worked for a Chinese company, I worked for a Russian company, I worked for a Thai company, a few other companies. I had private clients and a bunch of different things, a lot of adult learners in the former Soviet Union and some people in the Middle East because of that. And so a lot of interesting things there. And so I'm not against online stuff. I'm taking online schooling right now, and I've taken a bunch that way, and hugely beneficial. But it's I think also important to realize that you're not having full conversations on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, these types of things. And so the discussions, like, it's important that people debate those things, like in the Facebook groups, and the issues are brought up, but I don't think they're going to be resolved there, and you're probably not going to change anyone's mind there. I have changed people's minds in my 2 decades of debating things online in philosophy, which covers all spheres, of course, and I have had my mind changed, and I've made friends that I've never met in person in New Zealand and Australia and different places around the world, which I've had very important conversations with in the United States and in a number of different countries that I'm strongly connected to for different reasons. But that number is hugely dwarfed by the number of bad and useless interactions that I had where no one changed their mind and no one even got any more understanding on a subject. So I think it's important for people to have real and full human interactions as well, but then to have technology available to get information out there and to interact with technology in that way too. There's an important balance there. And I think humanity is going through a major change, a bigger change than people realize currently. And I think people are feeling it, but it isn't usually articulated by anyone, really. People just say that social media is bad, but not necessarily sure exactly why. Well, if anyone has anything else, feel free to reach out to me anytime. I mean, you can call the Township, of course, and people message me in a bunch of different ways. You can email me, supervisor@daltontownship.org. Feel free to stop in. My hours are inconsistent. They're all over the place. And so I try to hit hours here in the middle of the day in general. And so I figure that's when people may be stopping in the middle. But if people want to meet at other times, I'm completely open to that as well. There was the comment about me enjoying the job more. And I wrote an article recently, do I like being a supervisor? And the short answer is no. And, I expected that coming in, which I think surprises people. Because when they ask me, do you like the job? And I say no, people are surprised. And I'm always surprised they're surprised. Like being a politician would be such a great thing. And I didn't think it would be. And I think I have a realistic aspect on that because I've observed a lot of things in the world and studied history. But I also think it's important And, you know, meaning doesn't necessarily correlate with happiness. I would refer people to Viktor Frankl on this. It's great. His logotherapy, right, survived the concentration camps in Germany and came away with a philosophy he developed beforehand. But he considered the concentration camps having proved logotherapy in some of his basic assumptions, that there's always meaning in life and that people's primary pursuit is for meaning, and I agree with that, and that free will exists, which is almost a metaphysical statement, right, but has to do with epistemology as well, and that has huge implications in ethics, which leads to things like politics and aesthetics, which are really the things that kind of run our lives in the end, but they're grounded in that deeper philosophy. And so I don't do things just because I think they would be happy, necessarily, big things like this. I think they should be grounded in whether you consider them important, whether you think you can make a positive difference, whether a change is desirable, whether it's feasible, whether it's viable. That's a big thing in the business startup world. Those are the big things. And feasible and viable, I think, are confusing terms, because it should have probably been something like feasible for is it attainable, and then sustainable. You know, can you continue it, instead of necessarily viable, because they're almost synonyms. But nevertheless, when I assess things, that's what I attempt to do. And so, am I achieving some sort of creative or experiential or attitudinal value? And I am here. It's frustrating. It happens slower than in like a private organization, like a business. And I very purposely don't want to destabilize and change too many things too fast. I think you get a reaction against that. You get a reaction against that in the next election. You know, and I have been criticized. I was being criticized last night by a guy I know about not wanting to run for office again. And I said that I didn't plan on running for office again while I was running for office the first time. And I've been criticized on that in a number of different directions, which is very interesting, but I'm still not convinced to run for office. I have some other things I want to move on to. I have spinal deformities, health issues from that, which keep getting better, so I think my best health years are still ahead of me, actually. And I think I can make that true. I believe that will be true, which is extremely unusual. I've already recovered in a miraculous way, right? You can make the case that I'm a miracle, and I had a neurosurgeon tell me that. So which I really appreciate. You know, it humbles you in some way, being on your deathbed, which I've been in Africa. You know, being told you're going to die, thinking you are, and being left for dead, and then also recovering in a very unique way. You know, I think those both humble you in different ways. But I have some other things I want to move on to, and I'll probably have a shortened lifespan, so I need to get on with them relatively soon. I have to live kind of fast. And then it's you know, it's important to, I think, serve your time and do your civil and civic duty. I think that's hugely important. And then I think it'll be a step for someone else. But I also think it puts me in a unique position for solving problems. And some of the criticism I heard at first from other politicians and other municipalities, which I've gotten a lot of criticism from other politicians and other municipalities. Like, they're very nervous for me releasing so much information. You know, they're like, you're going to get sued. You can't release all this information. And I'm like, well, I wouldn't mind standing in front of a judge for the reason that I've made the government too transparent. I really don't have an issue with that. And it's foiable information anyway, so there shouldn't be a problem there anyway. But nevertheless, this idea that I'm going to have a short-term view because I'm only in office for 4 years. But I think that's untrue. I think we can see in the past with some of the financial problems and everything, there was a short-term view before. And I've tried to emphasize a long-term view in everything that we've been doing, because that's very important. You need to set things up over the long term. It's very important for society and life. It's lived over relatively long periods of time, so you need to, at a minimum, be thinking in years to decades, right? That's a kind of an appropriate time frame to think. You have to act in a shorter periods of time, but that always has to be there. That has to be the consideration. And then it allows me to bring up unpopular problems and say, look, this is a problem that we need to solve, and it'll probably make me unpopular. I mean, the finances on the sewer are just, they're just they're horrible. They're detrimental for the township, and they have to be solved. Like, it'll come to a head because the fund is set to go bankrupt somewhere like in the middle of 2025, and it's a huge issue. And to solve it, some people are not going to let me. But my goal isn't to be liked by people. And if you're trying to get elected, your goal is to be liked by people. But my goal is to solve problems, to fix problems, to encounter them, to reveal them, right? To shine a light on the darkness, and to get things moving in a good direction that'll set it up in a positive way over the long term. And I think going in with the mindset of doing one term actually frees me up to do that to maybe a greater extent than if I was planning on doing multiple terms. And so people keep making the case, and a lot of people keep making a stronger case that I should do 2 terms. But I have 2 years and 7 months left, and I'm going to do as much good as I can within that amount of time. And I'm sure people have told me that they're going to continue to try to convince me to do another term, and we'll see. There's a bunch of things I've gotten criticized over, as it's going to happen, right? Because that mass negotiation. My idea of not doing raises for the elected officials for the first 2 years I got pushback on that, which I was surprised, because I'm saying that the politicians shouldn't get raises. I think there should be pushback if the politicians say they should get raises, which is what the annual meeting of the electors is actually for. And so I want that to stay in place, because I think the electors should be able to override the politicians giving themselves raises. And I understand the argument on the other side that if you keep that amount too low, then no one can take the job, and no one will want to take the job that can do a decent work, that can do a decent job. And so it's hard to say that the township has financial trouble and then also be given a raise to myself. And so, but I think it's more worthy of consideration in these last 2 years moving forward than it was in the first 2 years. Because at that point we're setting up for the next group coming in, or I don't know who else will run for the position again, but at least the next supervisor coming in, we're setting up for them, and so that they can have a type of wage that can support someone that can come in and do a good job. And so I'll definitely get criticized on both sides for that. In most issues I do catch some criticism on both sides for sure. Which I think is appropriate, right? Hopefully it's appropriately balanced in some way. All right, well, if anyone has anything else, feel free to reach out anytime. I'm not planning in a huge way to do any more of these. I think this kind of wraps up this trilogy. We'll try to do more positive things for the township moving into the future. I'll keep doing my video updates, and we'll get a better audio-visual system so you can actually see better and hear better for the meetings in this room itself. We're working on doing a mental health thing with Alan Stiles, the fire chief, because he does mental health trainings for the emergency responders and the firefighters around the state, and getting that into a format that will apply to private citizens, because it's a little long and it's a little intense. But how do you tell that other people are stressed? How do you deal with that situation? How do you deal with stressful situations? I think will be good. And mental health is a huge aspect of modern society. We're seeing our mental health definitely decline, and major issues with that. And so hoping to get that together relatively soon. And I spent 1 day teaching the 8th graders at Reese Puffer last year about local politics and just how it works, and that they don't have to be afraid of it, right? Moving into their adulthood, that they could be involved. It's not this big scary thing. It's certainly not that the politicians are eminently more qualified or competent than you. You can get engaged and think about the issues and debate them and deliberate, and that engagement is hugely important. And I've been talking to the Elks about getting their Americanism essay writing contest more out into schools in that way. And I'm free to speak to little groups too. I spoke to a handful of people that are part of a militia group, And the militia is obviously a controversial subject, and it's important for all of these people to understand like how the different levels of government interact, right? That was one of their main questions, because you have the village, you have the township, you have the county, and then you have all these administrations. At the township level, we have the board of review, we have the planning commission, we have the zoning board of appeals, and how does all of that work? And like the village doesn't run elections, but they do collect their own taxes. But if you're there, you also pay township taxes. Like what's up with that? The administrations, as far as the health department or the road commission, these types of things at the county level, and then how do they interact with the township? Understanding that is important. And so I've had people reach out to me that want to know more about that and put together little groups, and that's very good. And I'll continue with those types of things. And if anyone else has any other ideas, feel free to reach out. I plan on continuing the monthly article in the White Lake Beacon, as long as they'll continue to put it in the White Lake Beacon. And so I plan on doing that through my term here. And then their website wasn't working very good. They switched out the editor and who was heading the paper, and they weren't able to get them online very well there. They were still coming out in print paper. But that's why I started just putting them on jeffthinks.com. JeffreyAlexanderMartin.com is what I'll redirect you to, but I had that for a number of years, and everyone was telling me how it was too big, but I didn't want anything weird. And I know a guy, I have a friend, and met through some discussion online, one of those positive interactions, and he lives in Australia. He had a television show as a self-improvement guy for a number of years, and he found it for me, JeffThinks.com, and he was like, here, here's one that would work good. And so it does. But I put them on there just so they're available online as well. Now I'll continue to look at ways, because I think that's one of my major roles as the head official in the township is making sure that communication is flowing from the people to the government, and then from the government to the people. And so people can go online and access the information that they're looking for and get updates and know what's happening. I think is hugely important. And obviously that, it's an ideal that everyone would know about everything. We're never going to get there, but that kind of sets the direction. And then online allows us to do it in a budget-friendly way. Otherwise, to send mailings to everyone in the township is thousands of dollars each time, and several $1,000s each time. And so it's not a great way. It's not like you can have a monthly article sent out in that way. It'd be a huge portion of the budget. But these other ways for allowing access to information are super important, and we're working on those as well. So if anyone has anything else, feel free to reach out anytime.